Hey Rainier View, so glad to be with the online campus today. My name is Joe and I'm the campus pastor here at our Parkland location. And today we're concluding our sermon series, Reconstruction, a series all about exploring questions and doubts people have when it comes to faith, God, and following Jesus in 2022. And I want to start today's message by talking about a shared experience that we all wish we could just do away with, and that's waiting. I hate waiting, you hate waiting, we hate to wait. That's why some of us have TSA pre-check and pay extra for Genie Plus so we don't have to wait 20 hours for Rise of the Resistance while we're being fried by the sun. It's also why we dread the DMV on the weekend, arrange our commute based on traffic, if at all possible, and can't stand that one person who knows they have more than 15 items in their cart and yet dares to use the express checkout lane at Safeway. You know, our time is such a precious and limited commodity that when we are forced to wait in life, it can be infuriating. And sometimes, I'll admit, it's petty. Sometimes I get upset at a traffic light for changing from green to yellow as if it was personal, as if they saw Joe come in and said, let's just stop this all. You know, sometimes I won't even make a cup of tea because I don't want to wait 5 minutes for the bag to steep. And ironically, if The Chosen fails to stream at a beautiful 4K and I have to sit there and watch it load up, I get upset with Comcast for delaying my time with Syrian Irish Jesus. I can't wait. You can't wait. We all just struggle with waiting. But that said, at other times, the wait is difficult because our longing is meaningful, right? Sometimes the wait is you watch your phone on the coffee table all day because you want that DM to confirm there's a second date. You hit refresh on your emails time and time again because you are dying to hear back on how that interview went. But as you know, the longing can be even more painful than this. You sit anxiously in the hospital lobby, hoping for the best while at the same time fearing the worst. You see the injustice all around you and question when goodness will no longer be so scarce. You experience loss way sooner than you expect, and you wonder how much longer you will have to know life without someone you love. If this morning you know the weight of waiting, then this Advent season is God's gift to you. Now, some of you may be hearing the word Advent for the first time, and others, you may be thinking of all those fun, overpriced calendars at Barnes & Noble, but regardless of how much you know or don't know about Advent, here's the LE5, the ELI5, explain like I'm 5 of this. Advent is a Latin word that means arrival. And it's a season that is meant to teach us how to wait well for the arrival of better days. Because you don't need me to tell you that life is far from perfect and there's a wide gap between how things are today and how things ought to be in the world. And I don't know about you, but for me, it is easy to lose hope in the waiting, especially when it feels like there is no end in sight. This is how the Jewish people felt back in Malachi's day. They were growing tired of waiting. In the 8th century BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by King TP3. In the 6th century BC, the southern kingdom of Judah was overtaken by King Neb. Then in the 5th century, the Jewish people got passed on to the Persians. In the 4th century, to the Greeks. And by the 1st century, to the Romans. Basically, if you've seen Andor, it's like being under the rule of the Galactic Empire, and then the Galactic Empire gets replaced by another bigger and meaner empire, and then this just keeps happening and repeating for the next 600 years. To be fair, if I was in their situation, I'm not sure how much longer I could wait for God. After all, if God was the creator of the universe and actually cared about the people, then why do the bad guys keep winning? Why does praying to Yahweh seem to produce little to no results? Why am I sacrificing at the temple when God doesn't prevent loved ones from getting sick? Why am I studying the scriptures when the crops keep failing and my community goes hungry? Why am I obeying Yahweh's command to be generous and compassionate and forgiving when people who don't follow God are doing much, much better than me? I think I would have joined in with the people in saying these words we find in the book of Malachi. It is futile to serve God? What do we gain by carrying out his requirements and going about like mourners before the Lord Almighty? But now we call the arrogant blessed. Certainly evildoers prosper, and even when they put God to the test, they get away with it. Malachi chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. The question that Israel was asking back then and that we continue to ask today is this: what's the point of faith when it seems like God is absent? I mean, why believe? Why build our lives around a God who isn't meeting expectations? And why do this crazy thing called church in 2022 when our prayers do not seem to be working? You know, this year we saw the second highest number of mass shootings in the U.S., and this was after Uvalde. And sadly, this is just one specific example out of the hundreds of other things going wrong in our country and in our world, which raises a really uncomfortable but honest question. Is God going to do anything about this, or are we just wasting our time waiting for him to act? Well, God gives us this answer through Malachi. Read along with me. Surely the day is coming. It will burn like a furnace. All the arrogant and every evildoer will be stubble. And the day that is coming will set them on fire, says the Lord Almighty. Not a root or a branch will be left to them. But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like well-fed calves. Then you will trample on the wicked. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says the Lord Almighty. In Jewish tradition, there was this concept known as the Yom Adonai, the Day of the Lord, which was incredibly unique for their cultural context because most people back then thought of time as a circle. And that makes sense when you think about it. In an agricultural society, you witness the seasons repeat themselves, and so it's not much of a stretch to project this reality onto human history. People are born, people die, nations fall, nations rise, rinse and repeat. But the prophets of Israel introduced a world-shattering idea that time is not tied to the cycles of nature, but to a God who is on a mission to redeem and save the world he loves. And this meant that time was not a circle, but a line that was moving towards something. And the moment it was moving towards, according to the prophets, was the Yom Adonai, the day of the Lord. Isaiah writes perhaps one of the most beautiful passages about this day. He says this: God will create a new heaven and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what God will create. For he will create a Jerusalem to be a delight to it, and its people a joy. He will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in his people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. The one who dies at 100 will be thought a child. The one who fails to reach 100 will be cursed. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. Did you catch that? According to Isaiah, a day is coming when we will forget how to cry, when living 100 years will no longer be worth celebrating, and somehow the interest rates will be good enough that we will all be building houses and growing fruit trees in the backyard. The day of the Lord is a promise that God's going to set things right again. He's going to bridge the gap between how things are and how things ought to be. And one day we won't look around wondering, where's God at? Because the evidence of his goodness won't just be all over our lives, but will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. But if God is serious about setting things right, then the day of the Lord must also involve, as Malachi tells us, judgment. And I get why passages like this are so unpopular and seems at odds with a loving God. In fact, I've heard people say that they can't believe in a God who would judge. And if that's you, I understand your hangups, especially if you've grown up in a church that depicts God as an angry tyrant who needs counseling, who's out to get you, and who wants to torture you in fire forever. And if that's the image you're getting, then yeah, that God sucks. But at the same time, I'm convinced that you would find God unloving if he didn't judge anyone. Think about this. If another kid pushed your child on the playground and the adult who was supervising did nothing because to punish the offender would be unloving, how would you feel? You'd be upset, right? I hope you would be. And you would refuse to accept that any definition of love fails to take seriously the harm done to your child. Likewise, if God tolerated evil and held no one accountable, then we would be hard-pressed to say that God cares about anyone. Because we all understand that real love isn't indifferent, but it takes a side. We don't want a God who sees all the inequalities in the world and just responds with, oh, well, I'm not going to deal with that because I don't want to hurt any feelings or get political. No, we want a God who stands with the powerless, who confronts injustice, who puts an end to evil, who takes a side. So even though what Malachi has to say about the Yom Adonai, about the day of the Lord, is uncomfortable, it's not in our best interest to cancel a God who separates the righteous from the wicked. Because only a judging God is a loving God. And only a loving God can give us real hope in the waiting. Because if God is going to do nothing about the mess we're in, then yeah, faith is pointless. But if there is a God who cares about the world, who intends to act in history and make things right again, then our wait isn't for nothing. Now, that doesn't mean waiting is easy or that God would never make you wait longer than what you might consider to be reasonable. Case in point, after speaking through Malachi, God stays silent for 400 years. That's a long time. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of God's silence, then you can imagine the frustration and doubt Malachi's community must have felt, especially when the last words they hear from God is this: "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with destruction." Merry Christmas. I don't know about you, but if that's the last thing I heard from God, I'm not feeling very encouraged or merry. I would probably be asking God, that's it? Why not just send the prophet now? Why not turn the hearts of parents and children to you already? Why would you end any sentence with strike the land with destruction and then go quiet for 400 years? I mean, who's your editor for the Old Testament? And what was the point of waiting 400 years to make the world right again? Well, according to the historian Justo Gonzalez, there was a purpose to the delay. Because when God decided to enter the world on Christmas Day, enough time had passed for Alexander the Great to spread Greek culture throughout the world, allowing different ethnic groups to interact in ways they never could have in the past. Enough time had passed for the Romans to build a 75,000-mile road network, making travel more efficient than ever. And enough time had passed for Jews living outside of Israel to form synagogue communities, share their faith with non-Jews, and produce a more accessible translation of the scriptures in Greek, which we call the Septuagint. You see, God wasn't just sitting around for 400 years twiddling his thumbs doing nothing, but as Gonzalez puts it, on the contrary, one can see the hand of God preparing the advent of Jesus in all the events prior to the birth and in all the historical circumstances around it. In other words, what we might mistake as God's silence, God's laziness, and God's carelessness is in fact the slow, steady, and faithful work of God to work through human history to create the optimal conditions in which Jesus' life, death, and resurrection can usher in the redemption of the world. And I'm not saying 400 years wasn't a long time to wait, but our hindsight tells us that God didn't waste a single year. So perhaps we can trust that he won't waste our time either. There's been more hurt, tragedy, and bad days than I can name over the last 2022 years, let alone in the last 12 months alone. And I get that it can be difficult to wait any longer for God to make things right again. But let's not forget this. Just because God isn't on our schedule doesn't mean he ain't on time. Because even when we see nothing, God is up to something. And this season of Advent is here to remind us that though there may be delays with God, it is always worth the wait. Because God over-delivered on his promises then, and if he did it before, he will do it again. So this Advent, don't rob yourselves of hope, because the wait may be hard, but the wait isn't for nothing. That's why we celebrate this month. That's why we can sing Joy to the World this Saturday. Not because life is perfect, not because we don't have anything to worry about, but because we have every reason to believe that someday God is going to make it better, and when he does, he will be right on time. If you know this to be true, then come celebrate with us on Christmas Eve. And while you're at it, let's make sure we don't keep this joy to ourselves, this hope to ourselves. Odds are you may know someone who is struggling right now, who is just waiting for their life to make sense, who feels like God has been absent, is not for them, and who doubts there can even be real joy or hope in their lives. And if someone is coming to mind, would you be willing to invite them to join you this Christmas at Rainier View? Not because Rainier View wants something from them, but because we are convinced God has already given us the biggest gift in Jesus. And what Jesus has done and is doing is too big not to share. So send out that invite. Don't forget to bring yourself, and we look forward to celebrating God's gift of hope and joy this Christmas with you. God bless.